On the morning of November 3rd, 1957, a small dog named Laika was sealed inside a metal sphere no larger than a washing machine, bolted to the top of a rocket that had never been designed to bring her home. Outside, the air at Baikonur bit with dry steppe cold, and inside the capsule the oxygen system began its steady hiss, because in a few hours, if the launch worked, she would be the most famous living creature on Earth, and also the most doomed. For decades, people have repeated the same comforting explanation for why the Soviet Union sent dogs before humans. It was science, it was caution, it was a necessary step. That's true, but it is not the full truth. The darker reason was not simply that dogs could test life support systems. It was that in the Soviet space race, a human life was a political weapon, too valuable to risk until the Kremlin could control the outcome, and dogs were the expendable currency that let the USSR gamble at full speed. To understand how that gamble began, you have to go back to the end of a different war, in a different kind of ruin. In 1945, Germany collapsed into shattered cities and captured laboratories, and among the most valuable prizes for the victorious powers were not just tanks or territory, but equations, blueprints, and engineers. The rocket complex at Peenemünde, which had produced the V-2, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, had already shown what modern rocketry could do. It could turn physics into terror. Between September 1944 and March 1945, V-2 rockets struck London and Antwerp, killing thousands and proving that a missile didn't need a pilot or even a chance of survival to deliver destruction. The Americans and the Soviets both rushed to seize what they could. The United States brought Werner von Braun and other German specialists to America under Operation Paperclip. The Soviet Union, after taking parts of Eastern Germany, carried out its own massive transfer of expertise. On October 22, 1946, thousands of German engineers and their families were abruptly moved east in an operation known as a Słowiokim. Entire workshops, test stands, and technical archives were hauled into the Soviet system. It was not a friendly recruitment, it was a strategic extraction, done in the same atmosphere of fear and secrecy that defined the early Cold War. In Moscow, the rocket program became an unusual creature, militarized, secret, and split among rival bureaucracies. It was also haunted. Stalin's Soviet Union had made technological leaps before, but it had done so by grinding human beings into the machinery through the Gulag, through forced labor, through purges that could remove a chief engineer as easily as they removed a poet. Even after Stalin's death in March 1953, that culture did not vanish overnight. If anything, it left behind a habit of thinking that the state's goals were cosmic and the individual's body was just material. The Soviet rocket effort was driven by the military because the most urgent use of rockets was not exploration but delivery. An intercontinental ballistic missile would change the balance of power. It would allow the USSR to threaten the United States without needing a bomber fleet that could be shot down, and the man who would become the central architect of Soviet spaceflight, Sergei Korolev, knew what it meant when the state wanted results. Korolev had been arrested in 1938 during the Great Terror, beaten in interrogation, and sent to the Kolyma camps, one of the harshest parts of the Gulag system. He survived by accident and endurance and by being transferred into a Sharashka, a secret prison design bureau where engineers worked under guard. When he rose after the war to lead the rocket program, he did so in a world where failure could still destroy you, where secrecy was enforced not just by classification stamps but by fear. Korolev's job was to build rockets that worked, not someday, now. And in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Soviet rockets had a problem. They were violent machines built at the edge of material science, combustion stability, and guidance technology. Engines could explode from oscillations, fuel lines could rupture, valves could freeze, control systems could drift, parachutes could fail. Every launch was a statistical argument with gravity, and gravity didn't negotiate. So, when Soviet scientists began sending living creatures upward, it wasn't just curiosity, It was triage. Before you could even consider putting a cosmonaut into a capsule, you needed to know whether a body could survive the acceleration, the vibration, the brief weightlessness, the terrifying transition back through the atmosphere, and the jolt of landing. The early flights were not orbital, but suborbital shots on modified ballistic rockets, still dangerous enough to kill. The choice of animal mattered. The United States, in its early bioastronautics work, often used monkeys, especially rhesus macaques, because their physiology was closer to a human's. The Soviets went another way. They chose dogs, and not just any dogs, stray dogs from Moscow's streets. The reasoning was practical and cold. Strays were thought to be tougher, used to hunger and harsh weather, more resilient to stress. They were small enough to fit inside tight capsules. They could be trained to tolerate confinement, and as part is often left unsaid. They were easier to acquire and easier to sacrifice without provoking the kind of public outcry that a dead human would unleash. In the Soviet system, public outcry mattered in a peculiar way. There was no free press, but there was propaganda, and propaganda demanded triumph. A dead cosmonaut would not be a tragic scientific loss in 1950s Soviet politics. It would be ammunition for enemies and a stain on the party's claim to lead humanity into the future. The Soviet leadership wanted first satellite, first living creature in orbit, first human in orbit, but it wanted them without the risk of a visible catastrophe that could crack the image of inevitability. And dogs offered a grim advantage. Even failure could be repackaged as progress. A dog could be celebrated as a pioneer without the state having to account for her as a citizen with a family, a workplace, a political identity. If a dog died, it was sad, yes, but it could be framed as noble. If a human died, it raised questions the USSR could not afford. Was the state reckless? Was the technology inferior? Was the dream of communism's scientific destiny a lie? The first major Soviet dogflights began in the early 1950s. On July 22, 1951, dogs named Dzik and Tsygan were launched on an R-1 rocket, derived from the V-2, reaching a high altitude and returning safely by parachute. It was not orbit, it was a brief punch above the atmosphere, a test of survival and recovery. But for the people who built those capsules, it was a crack in the wall between biology and space. A living mammal could go up and come back. The program continued with more canine flights, and not all were successes. Dzik, who had survived the first mission, died on a later flight when the parachute failed. The margins were that thin. Behind each of these tests was a growing apparatus of biomedical monitoring sensors for pulse, respiration, temperature, and motion, wired into cramped cabins that rattled like toolboxes in an earthquake. The dogs were trained to eat gelatinized food, to endure being strapped in place, to tolerate the noise and vibration. They wore harnesses and electrodes. Their bodies became data points. This wasn't cute, and it wasn't symbolic. It was the state forcing life into a shape that could be measured. At the same time, Soviet rocket engineering was racing toward a bigger goal, the R-7 Semyoka, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. Designed under Korolev, the R-7 was enormous, powerful, and temperamental. It was meant to hurl a nuclear warhead across continents, but it could also lift something else, a satellite. In the mid-1950s, the idea of launching an artificial satellite became a political obsession, especially with the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958, encouraging scientific projects worldwide. The Americans were preparing their own satellite attempts. The Soviets saw an opening if they could put a satellite into orbit first. It would be an ideological victory that would echo around the world. On October 4, 1957, they did it. Sputnik 1 went up and began its simple, relentless radio beeping and electronic heartbeat that could be heard by anyone with the right receiver. The shock in the United States was immediate and profound. It wasn't just fear of being behind in science. It was fear that the rocket that could lift Sputnik could also lift a nuclear warhead. The Sputnik crisis wasn't media hype. It was a strategic jolt, a reminder that distance no longer guaranteed safety. But in Moscow, victory wasn't a finish line, it was a demand for more. The Soviet leadership understood something fundamental about propaganda. You cannot win once. You have to keep winning before the other side catches up. There was little time to savor Sputnik. Almost immediately, pressure mounted for a second, more dramatic feat, something that would deepen the impression that the USSR was not merely competitive, but dominant. This is where the story becomes darker, because the second feat was not chosen for careful science. It was chosen for impact. The date mattered. November 7 was the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the most important holidays in the Soviet political calendar. A spectacular space achievement in early November 1957 would not just impress foreigners, it would crown the regime's own myth of history. The revolution had promised a radiant future. A living creature in orbit would look like the future arriving on schedule. The problem was time. Building a reusable life support system, designing a capsule that could deorbit on command, testing a heat shield and landing system, this took months, years. The Soviet Union did not have that, not if the goal was early November. What it had was an R-7 that could reach orbit and a team that could build a simple payload quickly. The decision that followed was as much political as technical. They would put a dog in orbit, and they would accept that she would not return. The dog they chose became Laika. She was a small, mixed-breed stray, about 3 years old, captured from Moscow streets. She was not selected because she was uniquely suited to space in some romantic sense. She was selected because she was calm under pressure and small enough for the capsule. The program's handlers preferred female dogs because they were easier to fit with urine collection devices. This detail, mundane and bodily, underlines how unglamorous the enterprise really was. The spacecraft was Sputnik 2, and it was built in a rush so frantic it bordered on improvisation. Engineers worked around the clock. The capsule included a life support system with oxygen regeneration, a fan to regulate temperature, and sensors to transmit biomedical data. It also included food and water for multiple days, because the original plan, on paper, was for Laika to survive for some time in orbit. But there was no functional return system. There was no heat shield designed for re-entry. Once Sputnik 2 reached orbit, Laika's fate was sealed by design. Here is where propaganda and reality began to split into two different histories. The Soviet public narrative at the time suggested that Laika would live for days and then be humanely euthanized before oxygen ran out. For years, variations of this story persisted, but later disclosures and research clarified what actually happened. Laika did not survive for days. The capsule overheated. The thermal control system failed under the combined effects of inadequate insulation, the spacecraft's exposure to sunlight, and the stress of launch. According to later accounts from those involved, including information presented decades afterward, Laika likely died within hours, overheated and panicked, her heart rate soaring under the stress of a mission designed to be survivable only in the abstract. Imagine the sensory reality, the roar and vibration of liftoff shaking her bones, the sudden float as gravity's grip weakens, the capsule's interior warming beyond what a small mammal can tolerate, the fan perhaps failing to keep up, the air turning heavy. The telemetry would have shown the truth in numbers, pulse, respiration, temperature, cold streams of data, revealing a living creature sliding into distress. This was not an accident in the sense of a bolt snapping unexpectedly. It was an accident made more likely by haste, by political deadlines, by the decision to attempt an orbital life mission without the time to engineer it responsibly. And yet, from the standpoint of the Soviet state in 1957, Sputnik 2 was a triumph. It proved that a living organism could survive launch into orbit, at least briefly, and that biomedical telemetry could be transmitted from space. It also kept the USSR in the global spotlight. The West reacted with a mixture of awe and horror. Animal welfare groups protested. Newspapers printed photographs of Laika, transforming her into a symbol. But even outrage served a purpose. It kept everyone talking about Soviet space achievements. In the propaganda war, attention itself was valuable. Still, inside the Soviet scientific community, the mission left scars. Oleg Gazenko, one of the leading figures in Soviet space medicine, later expressed regret about Laika's death, saying in retrospect that they had learned too little from the mission to justify it. That kind of statement matters because it shows that even within a system that demanded results, individuals could look back and feel the weight of what they had done. The story did not end with Laika. If anything, her death accelerated the next phase, because now the Soviet leadership had proven a point to the world and to itself. Orbit was possible, and life could be carried there. The next question was unavoidable. If a dog could go up, could a human? And if a human could go up, could the USSR do it before the Americans? But this is where the dark reason returns. Dogs were not just biological test subjects. They were political insulation. They allowed the Soviet program to gather data, refine systems, and build confidence, while postponing the moment when the state would have to risk a Soviet citizen in full view of the planet. The late 1950s and early 1960s became a brutal workshop of trial and error. More dogs were sent on suborbital and orbital missions as the Soviets refined life support, capsule design, and recovery techniques. These flights tested everything that would matter for human survival: oxygen systems, carbon dioxide scrubbing, temperature regulation, food delivery, waste management, and the ability to endure confinement and stress. They tested the effects of weightlessness on cardiovascular function and balance, and they tested whether a living body could survive the G-forces of re-entry and landing. Not all of these flights were successful, and the failures were not always public. The Soviet space program was famously secretive, and information about disasters could be suppressed or delayed. This secrecy had tactical value. Why hand your enemy evidence of weakness? But it also created a distorted historical memory, where success seemed smooth and inevitable. In reality, it was jagged and dangerous, and animals often paid for the gaps in engineering maturity. By 1960, the Soviet Union was preparing for a human spaceflight program that would soon produce Yuri Gagarin. But before a cosmonaut could be placed into orbit, the Soviets needed to prove they could bring a capsule back alive. It wasn't enough to launch. The return was where the physics became murderous. Re-entry meant intense heat and plasma sheathing the capsule. The descent meant parachutes that had to deploy correctly after months of storage and violent shaking. The landing meant impact forces that could kill if mismanaged. On August 19, 1960, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik V carrying 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, along with other biological specimens. This mission returned them safely to Earth after about a day in orbit. It was a landmark because it demonstrated a full loop: launch, orbit, re-entry, recovery. For the first time, the Soviets could point to a living mammal that had not merely reached space but had come back. The image of Belka and Strelka alive again was not just scientific validation, it was psychological permission. If dogs could survive the full mission profile, the argument for sending a human grew stronger. The public face of these missions was often cheerful: photographs of dogs, stories of brave little pioneers. But behind that face was the reality that these animals were being used as proxies for a risk the Soviet leadership was not yet willing to take with a human being. The calculus was harsh. The USSR wanted to be first with a human in space, but it could not afford to be first with a human in space. But it could not afford to be first with a human corpse falling from the sky. This fear was not theoretical. Early human spaceflight was a cliff-edge endeavor. The Americans experienced their own near disasters and tragedies later, but even before then, rocket programs worldwide were dangerous. The Soviet Union's missile and space development included catastrophic accidents, some of which were kept secret for years. The most infamous of the early period was the Nediland catastrophe on October 24, 1960, when an R-16 ICBM exploded on the launch pad at Baikonur during preparations, killing scores of people, often estimated around 70 to over 100, though precise numbers have been debated due to secrecy. The disaster demonstrated what everyone in the program already knew: rockets are bombs with paperwork, and a small mistake can incinerate a room full of engineers in seconds. In such an environment, sending a human into orbit was not just adventurous, it was politically radioactive. So the DOB program continued as a brutal kind of rehearsal. It provided data, yes, but it also provided cover. It bought time. It allowed Korolev's team to refine the Vostok spacecraft design, to test ejection seats and parachute systems, to verify that the capsule could survive re-entry heating. It allowed the state to approach the moment of human flight with a narrative of careful progression, first animals, then humans. A story of responsibility. A story that hid the fact that some progress was purchased with deaths that could be framed as acceptable losses. And then, finally, the moment arrived when even that insulation could not delay the inevitable. The Soviet Union had to decide whether it would risk a man. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin launched aboard Vostok 1. The flight lasted 108 minutes. He became the first human to orbit the Earth. The world remembers the smile, the youth, the triumphant photographs. It was the cleanest possible propaganda victory. A Soviet citizen, a pilot, an emblem of the new man, calmly circling the planet while the USSR's rivals watched. But the machinery beneath the triumph was still precarious. Vostok's design included an ejection system. Gagarin did not land inside the capsule, but bailed out and parachuted down, a detail that was concealed initially because international aviation records had specific requirements for piloted flights. Even in victory, the story had to be managed. The state did not just want success, it wanted success to look a certain way. When you place Laika's mission next to Gagarin's, the contrast is almost cruel. Laika was launched when there was no plan to recover her, propelled by political urgency and a desire to dominate headlines. Gagarin was launched when the Soviets believed they could control the outcome, when the system had been tested and retested in part on the bodies of animals that could be lost with less political risk. This is the darker reason in its simplest form. Dogs went first because the Soviet Union needed living test subjects, but could not accept the political consequences of human failure. In a race where perception was power, the Kremlin treated a human life as a strategic asset that could not be risked until the probability of a clean victory was high enough. Animals were the buffer zone between ambition and accountability. Yet it would be dishonest to reduce everything to cynicism alone. The scientists and engineers were not cartoon villains. Many were driven by genuine scientific curiosity, national pride, and the intoxicating sense of standing at the threshold of a new epoch. Korolev, a survivor of Stalin's prisons, understood both the cruelty of the state and the grandeur of the work. The doctors and technicians who trained dogs and monitored their vital signs often formed attachments to their animals. Some accounts describe handlers taking dogs home, caring for them, treating them as companions in the bleak, lockdown world of military research facilities. The emotional reality was complicated. Affection coexisted with use, care coexisted with sacrifice. And this complexity is what makes the story linger. Because Laika's mission was not simply a one-off tragedy. It was a window into how the Soviet system converted living beings into instruments of state narrative. In a society where the party claimed to embody the future could demand payment in flesh. The consequences unfolded in layers. In the immediate aftermath, the Soviet Union gained enormous prestige. Sputnik II cemented the image of Soviet technological daring. It also pushed the United States to accelerate its own efforts, feeding into the broader militarization of science and the expansion of NASA, which was founded in 1958. The space race escalated. Budgets grew. Rhetoric sharpened. The Cold War became not only a contest of armies and ideologies, but a contest of orbits and milestones. But the ethical consequences also grew. Laika became one of the first truly global symbols of the moral cost of space exploration. She was a living creature with no comprehension of ideology, used to satisfy an ideological timetable. The fact that her story provoked outrage even across the Iron Curtain suggested something important. Even at the height of Cold War dehumanization, there were limits to what ordinary people could accept when suffering was made visible and personal. Inside the Soviet Union, the official narrative long remained sanitized. The state did not admit the mission's full reality in 1957. It could not, because admitting that Laika died quickly from overheating would reveal haste, and haste would reveal vulnerability. Vulnerability was exactly what Soviet propaganda existed to deny. It was only decades later, as archives opened and participants spoke more freely, that the details became clearer and the moral reckoning more explicit. Even as the USSR continued its animal flights and then its human space program Voskhod, Soyuz, the shadow of early sacrifices remained. Space exploration in the 20th century was never clean. The Americans lost astronauts in training and on the pad. The Soviets lost cosmonauts too, most famously Vladimir Komarov on April 24, 1967, when Soyuz 1's parachute failed and the capsule slammed into the Earth. Komarov's death, unlike Laika's, could not be absorbed into the category of expendable life. It was a national tragedy and an international shock. It demonstrated what the Soviet leadership had feared from the start, a very public human failure. In that sense, the DOD program was both a scientific stepping stone and a political strategy of risk management. It did not eliminate danger. It postponed the moment when danger would carry unbearable symbolic cost. And the irony is that the dogs themselves, those tough, half-wild Moscow strays, were sometimes better suited to the early capsule environment than a human might have been. They tolerated confinement. They endured the stress with a physiological resilience that made them useful proxies. But usefulness was never the same as consent, and resilience was never the same as safety. The dogs were chosen precisely because they could be pushed. Laika's own spacecraft, Sputnik 2, remained in orbit for months, a silent tomb circling the planet. It re-entered Earth's atmosphere and burned up on April 14, 1958. By then, the story had already detached from the reality. Laika had become myth, martyr, mascot, depending on who was telling it. That is what propaganda does. It takes an event and extracts what it needs, leaving the inconvenient parts behind. Look closely at the chain of decisions, and you can see how tightly it was wound. The Soviet Union wanted to demonstrate the power of the R-7 rocket, a weapon system as much as a scientific tool. Sputnik 1 had done that. Then the political calendar demanded another victory. The engineers were ordered to deliver. There was no time for a recoverable capsule, so they chose a mission that could be launched quickly with a living passenger who would not be coming back. The resulting death was then managed through controlled information, because the USSR needed admiration, not questions. Admiration strengthened deterrence. Admiration strengthened deterrence. Admiration influenced non-aligned countries. Admiration made communism look modern. The dog was not sent first because the Soviets were uniquely cruel compared to everyone else in the era. The United States also conducted animal flights with fatal outcomes. The broader truth is more unsettling. Both superpowers treated living bodies, animal and human, as components in a strategic contest, and they did so under the pressure of fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of vulnerability. Fear that the future belonged to the other side. But there is something distinctly Soviet in the way Laika's mission unfolded. The speed, the secrecy, and the willingness to treat a life as an acceptable loss to meet a symbolic deadline. The Soviet state was built on grand narratives of historical necessity, and those narratives could justify almost anything if it served the revolution's supposed destiny. In that worldview, a dog's death could be framed as a small price for proving that communism was reaching the stars. And yet, history has a way of making symbols escape their creators. Laika did not remain a simple Soviet triumph. Over time, she became an emblem of the moral ambiguity of technological progress. Statues and memorials were later erected in Russia to commemorate her. Her story is taught not only as a first, but as a warning. The very mission designed for propaganda became, in the long run, a reminder that propaganda has a cost. The long-term consequences reach into the present because the basic dilemma never went away. Modern spaceflight is safer than it was in 1957, but it is still dangerous. It still depends on test programs, on risk calculations, on deciding what level of loss is acceptable in pursuit of exploration or national prestige. When new space powers rise, when private companies race for milestones, the old questions return in new clothing. Who bears the risk? Who gets the glory? Who is remembered? And who is quietly written out of the narrative? Laika's capsule was small, metallic and silent, but it carried a truth that doesn't fit neatly into triumph stories. The first path into space was not paved only with genius and courage. It was paved with secrecy, deadlines, and bodies that could be lost without destabilizing the state's image. Dogs went first, not only because the science required it, but because the politics demanded a sacrifice that wouldn't endanger the myth. And perhaps that is the final, unsettling reflection. The space age did not begin as a pure expression of humanity's curiosity. It began as an extension of the same 20th century forces that had already reshaped the world war, ideology, coercion, and the relentless competition for dominance. Laika, staring into the unknown from a sealed capsule, did not know she was part of a global psychological battle. She did not know that her life was being used to prove a point about missiles, about modernity, about whose system owned the future. She only knew the vibrations, the confinement, the heat. Today, when satellites glide overhead in silent abundance and images from space are so common, they can feel ordinary. It is easy to forget how the first steps were taken, how much was improvised, how much was hidden, how much was hidden, how much was paid for in suffering that could be ignored because it belonged to the voiceless. The dark reason the USSR sent dogs before humans to space is not just a Cold War anecdote. It is a reminder that progress, when driven by fear and prestige, will always look for someone or something that can be sacrificed first.